The year was 1843, and the convent on the edge of St. Augustine stood like a stone guardian of holiness, or so the world believed. Its whitewashed walls shone beneath the southern sun, its iron bell rang each dawn, and its nuns moved like quiet shadows through long corridors. To outsiders, it was a sanctuary of purity, where prayer shaped every hour and where women sought peace from the corruptions of the world. But inside those walls, behind rosary beads and candlelight, a secret flourished so monstrous it would stain the church for generations. The first whispers began with babies, quiet infants wrapped in white cloth, carried out through the back gate at night. Those who saw them believed they were orphans taken in by the kindly sisters, children of tragedy given a chance at grace. But the truth was darker, deeper, and born from suffering. The convent's most hidden chamber, known only to a few, was the infirmary cellar, a place where no visitor was allowed, where the cries of labor were muffled behind stone walls, and where new life emerged in silence. The nuns called these newborns blessed babies, claiming they were handed to the convent by God, manifestations of divine intervention. But in reality, every one of those infants carried the blood of enslaved mothers, young women forced to work in the convent kitchens, laundry rooms, and fields. They had no voice, no rights, and certainly no freedom to protect their children. The convent kept them under obedience and fear, controlling their every moment. When their bellies began to swell, the sisters spoke of sinful temptation and hid them away from public view. And when their time came, the delivery was rushed, secretive, and stripped of mercy. These babies, the enslaved children of the convent, became currency. Wealthy families from Savannah, Charleston, and New Orleans came searching for infants they believed were pure, untouched, and blessed by God. They did not ask where these children came from, they simply paid. $200, a fortune at the time, for a perfectly quiet, perfectly healthy, perfectly pale child. Some families even believed adopting a blessed baby would secure God's favor upon their home. It was the church's perfect disguise. Holy language wrapped around human trafficking. But not every nun agreed to the silence. Among them was Sister Agnes, a quiet woman with trembling hands and a conscience that refused to die. She had seen too much. The young enslaved girls crying through labor, the priests who took advantage in the name of obedience, the secret ledgers locked in the cellar, each line marked adopted with a sum beside it. She had watched the newborns carried away first into the chapel for a false blessing, and then out the back gate into waiting carriages that rolled off into the night. The guilt gnawed at her like a hungry rat. The prayers she whispered no longer soothed her heart. Every candle she lit seemed to shine light on her sin. She had known these mothers, girls who survived loss, hunger, beatings, and now the theft of their own children. The convent called it divine service. Sister Agnes called it what it was, slavery reinvented under holy robes. The turning point came when one newborn opened his eyes mid-blessing and stared at her with a calmness that broke her. For the first time, she saw not a symbol or a transaction, but a life, a stolen life, a life she was helping deliver into a lie. Her hands shook, her breath caught. Something in her soul cracked open that night she made her decision. She would expose the truth, even if it meant losing her vows, her safety, or her life. But the convent was a fortress of silence, and the priests who ran it understood one thing better than scripture: how to bury a secret. What Sister Agnes didn't know was that she was being watched, and that the church had already chosen who would be blamed, who would be silenced, and who would never be seen again. The scandal was no accident, it was a system, and the final reckoning was only just beginning. The convent infirmary had always been a place of whispered prayers and quiet suffering, but by the early 1840s, it had transformed into something far more unsettling. Hidden behind a heavy wooden door near the chapel, it appeared ordinary at first glance. Rows of narrow beds, a table for tinctures, and shelves lined with jars of herbs dried by the sisters' own hands. But the real heart of the operation lay beneath it, down a set of narrow stone steps few were ever permitted to descend. This underground chamber, cold even in the heat of summer, had been converted into a secret birthing room. Its walls were thick, built from old coquina blocks that muffled every sound. The sisters said the room had been constructed for storage long before the convent was founded. The truth was that it had become a perfect hiding place. a womb of silence where no outsider could hear the cries of women or their newborns. Most of the nuns never knew what happened below their feet. They were told the infirmary cellar was used for storing medicinal supplies or old equipment. Those chosen to assist inside it were selected carefully. Women who had learned to bury their emotions, whose obedience had been tested, whose tongues remained still even when their hearts trembled. They were entrusted with the most damning secret the convent had ever held. The young enslaved women assigned to the convent never knew how trapped they truly were until their bodies betrayed them. Often, they did not realize they were pregnant until the senior sisters silently pulled them aside and led them away from the sunlit kitchens or laundry rooms into the stern quiet of the infirmary. Their questions were ignored. Their fear was met with scripture. Their pain, when it came, was seen as evidence of sin. One of the earliest girls brought down into the cellar was only 16. Her name was Ruth. She had been born enslaved on a nearby plantation and was leased to the convent for work. The nuns insisted they were offering her a peaceful Christian environment. In reality, she became one more silent body in their system. When her belly grew, she tried to hide it under the rough cotton apron, but a senior sister noticed. Ruth was dragged into the infirmary one humid August afternoon. Her trembling hands clutched her apron, and she pleaded softly to know what she had done wrong. The sisters said nothing. They guided her down the lantern-lit stairs into the cold chamber below. She realized, too late, that she would not be allowed to leave until her child was taken from her. The birthing room held only the bare essentials: a low wooden bed, a basin of water, a stack of cloths, and a crucifix mounted on the far wall. The crucifix was positioned so the women in labor would face it, as if to remind them that their suffering was being watched, judged, and recorded by heaven itself. When Ruth's labor began, her cries were soft at first, then grew desperate. Her pain echoed off the stone walls, but no one outside the chamber heard her. Sister Agnes, then a younger member of the infirmary staff, held her hand and whispered what little comfort she could. "Breathe, child. God is with you." But Ruth did not feel God. She felt only fear. Fear for herself, fear for the life inside her, and fear of what she sensed was about to happen. The moment the baby was born, Ruth reached out with trembling arms, desperate to hold her child. But the senior sister intervened quickly, snatching the newborn away and wrapping him in a white cloth. Ruth cried out, begging to see him, to touch him, to hear him breathe. Her pleas were silenced by a hand pressed over her mouth, and the words she would never forget. "He belongs to God now." The baby was carried upstairs, his cries fading as the door shut behind the senior sister. Ruth never saw him again. This was not an isolated incident. It happened again, and again, and again. Each birth was hidden behind scripture. The priests claimed the convent was doing the Lord's work by finding new homes for the innocent. They told the sisters God would forgive the sins of the mothers by allowing their children to be raised in righteous homes. But the truth was plain: these infants were being sold for $200 apiece to wealthy families seeking holy children. The money went toward maintaining the convent, enriching the church, and expanding its influence. The birthing room became a place of routine cruelty. The sisters lit candles and kept the room sterile, but no amount of holy decor could disguise what was happening. The enslaved women gave birth alone, afraid, and powerless. The nuns assisting them were torn. Obedience demanded silence. Conscience demanded rebellion. But most chose survival. Sister Agnes struggled more than the others. Every time she stepped into the birthing chamber, she felt as though she were stepping into a graveyard, one filled not with bodies but with stolen futures. The infants were whisked away, baptized privately, and assigned new names. The ledger kept in the cellar recorded every sale, date, child sex, buyer name, amount. Agnes had once opened it out of curiosity, only to feel her stomach twist when she saw pages upon pages of entries written with cold precision. The enslaved mothers were returned to work soon after birth, warned never to speak of what had happened. Most obeyed out of terror. A few whispered the truth among themselves late at night in the laundry room. They spoke of stolen children, of priests who prowled the halls after dark, of nuns who had lost their compassion. They spoke of running away, but where could they go? The convent walls were high and the church's reach was long. The infants became ghosts, not dead, but erased. and every ghost left a crack in the conscience of the women who were forced to participate. The birthing room remained the deepest secret of the convent, a secret built on screams no one would ever hear and tears no one would ever acknowledge. But secrets like this do not sleep forever, and the day would come when the truth clawed its way to the surface, because even stone walls cannot silence a stolen child forever. Beneath every holy place there is a room where truth is buried. In this convent, that room was literal. Most visitors saw nothing beyond the stained glass windows, the embroidered veils, the scent of incense curling like a velvet ribbon toward the altar. They believed the sisters lived in an untouched world of purity, prayer, and gentle hymns. But 2 floors below the chapel, under the marble, under the relics, under the bones of saints, there was a chamber no outsider had ever seen. A chamber the sisters called La Cuna Silenciosa, the silent cradle. It did not appear on convent blueprints. It did not appear in church records. It did not exist, unless you were one of the children who cried in the dark. Behind the chapel's confessional was a wooden panel carved with images of lilies and doves. Anyone who touched it would think it was decorative, part of the artisan woodwork donated generations ago. But the sisters knew which lily to press, 3 times slow, then once fast. Only then would the panel slide open with a whisper, exhaling a cold breath of earth and forgotten secrets. A stone staircase spiraled downward like a throat swallowing light. Each turn erased another layer of the church's deception. At the bottom waited the room that defined the convent's true purpose. The nursery was a circle of crude beds, each made of old wood, rope, and blankets that had been washed so often their color had vanished. Lanterns hung from hooks in the ceiling, casting a soft golden glow that barely reached the walls. In that dimness, the truth became clearer. This was not a place for holy works. This was a place for hidden sins. The air was thick with the smell of milk, damp cloth, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, the scent of women healing from childbirth beneath their habits. Each cradle was numbered, not with names, not with baptismal records, but with the initials of the nun who had given birth. Over time, the initials were scratched out and replaced when another sister repeated the cycle of silence, shame, and forced motherhood. The babies in these cradles were the convent's most guarded secret. They were not orphans, they were not abandoned by sinful outsiders. They were the nuns' own children, conceived through coercion, exploitation, or as payment for debts owed by wealthy parish men. Some were pale and frail, some were strong and loud, some had their father's eyes. But all shared the same fate. They were never meant to exist. A woman of God could not become a mother. A servant of the church could not carry a man's child. A nun's womb was supposed to be shut in devotion. But reality did not care about vows. Men with influence did not care about vows. And the convent had learned long ago that silence was easier to sell than truth. 3 nuns tended the nursery full-time. They whispered prayers over the children, not because they were blessed, but because guilt worked like a knife inside them. Each woman had her story. Sister Morena had been told at 17 that her purity would save her family from ruin. Sister Pilar's father sold her to the convent as an act of repentance. Sister Amada had given birth 4 times and never been allowed to hold any child longer than a single night. Their job was simple: feed the babies, keep them alive, prepare them for transfer. Transfer meant sale. Each child, once weaned, would be passed to a hidden network of church-approved brokers, men who handled holy adoptions, convincing wealthy, childless families that these infants were rescued blessings, tokens of God's mercy. The families never knew the truth. The church never admitted the system existed. And the nuns, who watched their own children leave in baskets, were expected to swallow their grief as though it were communion wine. If the stones of the nursery could speak, they would tell stories darker than any sermon. The midnight screams of women giving birth in silence. The soft weeping of sisters who wanted to confess but had no priest they trusted. The whispers of priests who came not to bless the room but to inspect merchandise. The cries of infants who would never know their mothers' names. The walls had absorbed every sin ever committed there, but sins, no matter how deep they are buried, have a way of rising again. Not every child was sold. Some simply vanished. The official explanation was always identical: the Lord has called this child home. But Sister Morena learned the truth by accident one night when she awoke to the sound of a scraping chair. She followed the noise and found a priest she knew, one who often visited the convent under the guise of confessional oversight. He was smothering a newborn with a cloth, mumbling a prayer as though he were performing a baptism rather than an execution. When he looked up, their eyes met. She froze. He smiled, and he said words she would never forget. This one was born too dark. It would raise questions. Just like that. A life ended because truth would inconvenience the church's image. The body was wrapped in white linen, placed inside a wooden box, and carried out through the back gate, where a shallow grave was always waiting. The convent had perfected its system. Women who bore children kept silent out of fear. Priests who fathered the children were protected by their rank. Families who purchased babies were shielded by ignorance. And the church itself benefited from donations attached to every miracle adoption. No one wanted to expose the nursery because too many had blood on their hands. It was the perfect crime, hidden in the holiest place, performed by those entrusted with purity. Whispers began to spread among younger novices. Children started asking questions about their origins. One day, a girl who had been adopted 18 years earlier returned to the convent, carrying a letter from her adoptive mother, a letter with the name of the nun who had birthed her. Names were not supposed to exist, records were not supposed to survive. But something had slipped, and the truth, like a crack in old stone, began to widen. The nursery beneath the chapel would soon face exposure, and the church would learn that sins committed underground always rise to the light eventually. The priests claimed it was a miracle, the nuns called it a blessing, and the wealthy families paid their $200 with trembling hands, believing themselves part of something holy. Yet behind closed doors, the reality was far grimmer. The infants being handed over were stolen from the enslaved women the convent had claimed to protect. These mothers, often no older than 16 or 17, had been brought into the convent under the guise of work and piety, only to be transformed into unwilling participants in a system that traded their children as though they were coin. The church, ever vigilant about its public image, had wrapped every transaction in ritual. Candles were lit, prayers whispered, and the words blessed by God were murmured over each infant. It was a careful performance designed to reassure the buyers, who were often members of the same parish, that they were adopting a child with divine favor. Inside the convent, the nuns were divided. Some followed orders without question, shielding their hearts from the horrors around them. Others, like Sister Agnes, felt every stolen cry and every tear of the enslaved mothers like knives cutting through their souls. Each night she would lie awake in her narrow bed, hearing the distant wails of infants she knew she would never see again, imagining the lives that would unfold far from their mothers, in homes that understood nothing of the theft and the suffering it had caused. Every time a child was carried away, the ledger in the cellar was updated, listing the date, the name of the purchaser, and the price. These pages, written in ink that had faded to a dull brown, recorded not blessings but betrayals. Each line a tally of innocents sold under the guise of divine providence. The system was precise. Nuns who had given birth were confined to the infirmary until their labor was complete, returned to work as soon as their bodies allowed, and told never to speak of their experiences. The enslaved mothers were treated with the same cold efficiency. Their pain was ignored, their grief silenced, and their questions met with warnings of eternal damnation. Any attempt to reveal the truth risked excommunication or worse, disappearance into the convent's darker corridors where few dared to tread. Those who were caught speaking were punished subtly but cruelly, stripped of privileges, removed from communal activities, or assigned to the hardest physical labor as a reminder that their silence was not optional. Despite these measures, the system was never perfect. Some infants were mishandled, some records miswritten, and some nuns could not keep their sorrow contained. One evening, Sister Marina found an infant trembling in its cradle, skin clammy, lips blue. The girl who had borne him was away, sent to the fields to wash laundry, leaving her child to a woman who knew little of care and less of love. Marina wrapped the infant in a warm cloth and whispered prayers into his ear, praying that God would forgive them all for the roles they were forced to play. She could feel the weight of the church's secrecy pressing down, and she knew that one misstep could bring ruin upon her, yet she could not stop her heart from aching at the injustice she witnessed nightly. The buyers often came on appointed days, led into the convent under strict supervision. They were shown the infants as if in a sacred ritual, allowed to touch them, hold them, and promise a future that was already stolen. The priests overseeing these exchanges never revealed the mothers' identities. They never mentioned that the children had been born in secrecy, in labor chambers hidden beneath the chapel floor. To the church, these infants were blessings, proof of divine favor and a testament to the holiness of the convent. To the nuns and enslaved mothers, they were reminders of a world that had no mercy, a world where innocence was purchased, sold, and hidden. Rumors began to spread among the townspeople, subtle murmurs about the blessed babies and the odd behavior of the nuns. Some noticed similarities in appearance among the adopted children, questions about their origins quietly forming in the minds of observant neighbors. No one dared speak openly. The church's influence was vast, its power unquestioned. Yet, within the convent walls, a sense of unease began to grow. The more the children were taken away, the more the nuns feared that the truth could one day surface. Their consciences, long suppressed, began to whisper warnings that could not be silenced entirely. Sister Agnes and others like her began to keep quiet notes, hidden in the folds of their habits or beneath floorboards. These notes detailed the infants' births, the conditions under which the mothers labored, and the identities of buyers. They were small acts of rebellion, desperate attempts to preserve a record that could someday expose the truth. The danger was immense. Discovery would mean immediate punishment, possibly even death. Yet the risk was outweighed by the need to ensure that the suffering of the mothers and the theft of their children would not vanish entirely into the shadows of history. As the years passed, the nursery beneath the chapel became a repository of hidden lives. Generations of infants were born, sold, and delivered into families who believed they were participating in holy providence. The nuns who assisted in this process were haunted by their complicity, carrying the weight of stolen childhoods like invisible shackles. The priests who supervised the transactions justified their actions with scripture, claiming that God's will required obedience and secrecy, and the enslaved mothers, powerless to protect their children, endured, hoping against hope that one day justice or revelation might come. Yet even in this darkness, small sparks of humanity persisted. Nuns who had once been silent whispered lullabies over the cradles, hidden notes were written and preserved, and some children escaped the system entirely, finding refuge in the woods, or with sympathetic townspeople. These acts, though minor, were dangerous challenges to the convent's authority, reminders that even in a system designed to erase truth, compassion could survive. The hidden nursery beneath the chapel was not merely a room, it was a symbol of corruption, secrecy, and human resilience. It held the stolen cries of infants, the silent grief of mothers, and the moral struggle of those who could not turn away. Every infant that left the convent carried with them a fragment of the darkness that had brought them into the world, and every act of quiet compassion preserved a fragment of light. In this room, beneath the altar and beneath the veil of holiness, the real story of the convent unfolded, a story of stolen lives, hidden sins, and the faint hope that truth, however suppressed, could someday emerge from the shadows. The convent was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place of peace and devotion, yet beneath its calm exterior, a storm of fear and complicity raged. The sale of the so-called blessed babies was not a spontaneous act of greed. It was the culmination of years of secrecy, hierarchy, and manipulation. Within the shadowed corridors, whispers of missing infants and silent births had begun to circulate, but the church had perfected the art of control. Any nun who dared to question, to look too closely, was met with subtle intimidation. They were reminded that their vows were not mere words but sacred bonds, and that God would punish disobedience. The threat of eternal damnation combined with the practical fear of punishment within the convent was enough to silence most. The nuns moved carefully, stepping over the moral boundaries of their own hearts, acting as facilitators in a system designed to profit from stolen innocence. Sister Magdalene, a young nun whose heart had not yet been numbed by years of obedience, began to notice inconsistencies that troubled her deeply. The infirmary cellar, where infants were secretly born, seemed almost alive with the weight of hidden lives. Each time she descended the steps, she was struck by the contrast between the chapel's serene sanctity above and the grim, damp reality below. There, infants cried softly in their cradles, their mothers gone, and the nuns who cared for them moved with mechanical precision, their faces masks of piety concealing a quiet resignation to a world gone wrong. Magdalene began to understand that this was not a charitable act of divine providence, but a carefully orchestrated scheme. Infants were being presented as holy gifts, while their origins were deliberately concealed, and the convent and church profited from the ignorance and faith of the wealthy. The priests who oversaw the operation were masters of psychological control. They would enter the nursery under the guise of blessing the children, their cassocks swaying, their hands raised in prayer. Their words were filled with scripture, each phrase carefully chosen to instill awe and trust in the onlookers, while masking the transactional nature of the event. Buyers, mostly affluent families, were eager to see the infants, to feel the holiness in their tiny bodies, and to secure the supposed blessings. They did not ask questions, or perhaps they refused to hear the answers. It was easier to believe in miracles than to confront the possibility that they were participating in the exploitation of innocent lives. For the nuns who labored in the nursery, the tension between obedience and conscience was unbearable. Some, like Sister Agnes, began to leave hidden notes for the infants, small records of their births and brief accounts of their mothers. These were placed carefully under floorboards or inside hollowed-out bricks, secret acts of preservation meant to testify to the truth if the world ever discovered the convent's crimes. Others numbly followed instructions, their empathy dulled by years of training in fear. The infants were cleaned, wrapped, and presented to the priests, who would then hand them to the buyers in a ceremony designed to appear sacred. Every step of this process was ritualized, transforming human suffering into a spectacle that could be called holy without raising suspicion. Despite the carefully maintained secrecy, cracks began to appear. Some infants were discovered to have faint bruises or signs of neglect, a result of the hurried and impersonal care they received. A few nuns, unable to endure the moral weight, would weep silently in the shadows, comforting infants who were about to be taken from them forever. The emotional strain was immense, compounded by the knowledge that their own vows demanded obedience, and that stepping out of line could bring punishment, disgrace, or even removal from the order. Rumors spread among the novices and young assistants. They whispered about the blessed babies, about infants who disappeared into the night, about nuns who returned from the infirmary pale and trembling. Some began to question whether the church truly sanctioned what they were witnessing. Others, terrified of being discovered, silenced their doubts and carried on. Magdalene, however, could not turn away. She began to catalog the events she witnessed in her mind, memorizing details, faces, and the expressions of the infants as they were handed over. She knew that someday the truth would need a witness. One night, Magdalene witnessed an infant who had been placed in a basket by a senior sister begin to stir and cry. The buyer, a wealthy merchant, had not yet arrived, and the priest supervising the ritual was momentarily distracted. Magdalene's heart pounded as she realized that the child could be seen in his natural state, unmasked by the veneer of ceremony. She wanted to intervene to protect him, but she knew the consequences of disobedience. Her hands shook as she placed a hand over her mouth, tears spilling from her eyes. The child's cries seemed to echo through the chamber, filling the room with a raw truth that the walls had tried to contain. The church's involvement in this operation ensured that few outsiders would ever question it. The ledger books, meticulously maintained and stored in the cellar, recorded every transaction, but were locked away from prying eyes. Priests were instructed to maintain plausible deniability, and senior nuns enforced the rules with a combination of discipline and fear. The entire system functioned like a machine, cold and efficient, yet powered by human suffering. Each infant sold represented a compromise of faith and morality, yet the operation persisted, shielded by ritual, secrecy, and the belief that obedience justified any act. As the years passed, the scandal grew within the walls of the convent, even if it remained invisible to the outside world. Magdalene and a few other conscientious sisters carried the burden of knowledge alone, haunted by the cries they could not answer and the innocence that had been stolen. The infants, sold under the guise of holiness, carried with them the legacy of exploitation, and the convent became both a fortress of faith and a tomb for truth. The contrast between the serene, holy appearance above and the grim reality below became more jarring with every passing day. It was in this tension between outward piety and hidden cruelty that the convent scandal was most deeply rooted. The infants' stolen lives and the nuns' compromised conscience formed a shadow that stretched across generations, leaving marks not only on those directly involved but on the church itself. And though the system was maintained with precision, it was never invulnerable. Whispers, doubts, and secret acts of rebellion ensured that the story of the blessed babies would not remain hidden forever, waiting for the moment when someone would dare to reveal the truth. The moment Sister Magdalene's body began to betray her, she faced a choice she had never expected to confront in the quiet corridors of the convent. Her belly, which she at first tried to hide beneath the heavy folds of her habit, could no longer be denied. Each morning, the reflection in the small, cracked mirror revealed a reality she was forced to name in secret. She was carrying a child. And yet, when she spoke of it to herself, her voice trembled. She insisted to anyone who might question her, or to the air itself, that it was not the product of earthly sin, but a miracle, a gift sent directly from God. In the eyes of the church, this was blasphemy, and in the eyes of the convent, it was scandal. Yet Magdalene's own heart refused to see it as anything but divine. The nuns around her, however, did not share her certainty. Some whispered prayers for her soul, terrified that the child she carried was a symbol of corruption, proof of weakness, or worse, proof of sin. Others, perhaps moved by superstition or genuine awe, dared to believe Magdalene's insistence that this child was chosen, a harbinger of God's will. Tension built like a storm inside the convent walls. The air, heavy with incense and the muffled sound of the chapel bell, seemed to thicken with fear and anticipation. Every glance cast her way felt like judgment, every whisper behind closed doors a verdict. Magdalene herself moved cautiously, masking her condition in loose robes, shuffling quietly through the hallways, and avoiding the staircases that led to the observation of the senior sisters. She knew that any hint of defiance against the established narrative could bring severe punishment. But the miracle she believed in, or the lie she was determined to maintain, demanded courage she had not yet needed in her life. She prayed constantly, silently, fervently, that her claim would shield her from scrutiny, that God would protect the child she carried from the machinery of secrecy and cruelty that dominated the convent. The priests arrived often, ostensibly to guide the nuns through spiritual discipline, but in truth to monitor the unfolding scandal. They questioned Magdalene with gentle probing, using scripture as a veil for interrogation. "Is the child truly of divine origin?" they would ask, their eyes dark with suspicion, their tone careful and measured. Each question carried the weight of authority, the threat of excommunication, and the chilling implication that disbelief or misstep could result in personal ruin. Magdalene, with her lips pressed tight, insisted firmly, "It is a sign, a gift from God." The priests, in private, shook their heads. They could not afford the truth to spread. To the wider church, the child was a potential disgrace. To Magdalene, it was proof of divine favor. Other nuns were forced to navigate a delicate balance between fear and devotion. Some feared that speaking out, defending Magdalene, or questioning the priest's motives would mark them as corrupt. Others, drawn to the possibility of divine intervention, allowed themselves to hope, praying that the child's birth would absolve their own hidden sins or bring the church a measure of tangible grace. Tension among the sisters grew, manifesting in cold glances across the refectory, whispered warnings behind closed doors, and the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in loyalty that fractured the convent into factions as the months passed. Magdalene's body became more visible evidence of the impossible, and the anticipation of the child's birth sent waves of anxiety through the convent. Preparations began in secret, the infirmary adapting to accommodate the event without alerting outsiders. The senior nuns debated, quietly, the morality, propriety, and potential scandal of the situation. Some believed the child should be hidden entirely, delivered without ceremony, removed from Magdalene immediately. Others, whether out of belief, fear, or curiosity, argued for a careful, witnessed birthing process that might allow for some measure of protection under the guise of church ritual. Meanwhile, Magdalene's own fear grew daily. She could feel the eyes of both the living and the absent pressing on her. She sensed the silent judgments of the infants who had come before, the invisible cries of mothers whose children had been sold, and the unrelenting surveillance of the priests who moved like shadows in the halls. Sleep became impossible. Her prayers, once simple and sincere, grew long and desperate, murmured into the night as she clutched her swollen belly. She imagined the child's eyes, the curve of his small hands, and whispered vows that she would protect him no matter the cost. The community outside the convent remained blissfully unaware. To the townspeople, Magdalene was merely another nun performing her devotions. They did not see the weight of expectation, the fear, or the moral turbulence that consumed her and those around her. For the outside world, the church's image remained untarnished. Inside, however, every corridor and shadowed stairwell carried a tension so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Whispers began to circulate. Would the child survive? Was it truly divine? Who would claim it, and what would be done if the truth was discovered? By the final weeks of her pregnancy, Magdalene moved with a careful deliberation, each step measured, each interaction cautious. The nuns around her had shifted into roles dictated by fear, obedience, or conviction. Some offered support in quiet, almost hidden gestures, a hand on her shoulder, a warm loaf of bread, a whispered word of encouragement. Others remained cold, distant, their gazes sharp reminders of the precarious balance she maintained. The priests, ever vigilant, increased their visits, their questions growing more pointed, their scrutiny less subtle. They reminded Magdalene that God's will was paramount, that obedience was required, and that the consequences of failure would be devastating. Yet even in this suffocating environment, Magdalene's faith in the child's miraculous nature did not waver. She whispered prayers, sang lullabies before the birth, and imagined a future in which the child would survive, thrive, and perhaps illuminate the corruption and secrecy that had governed the convent for decades. She clung to this vision, knowing that in the darkness of fear, the hope of divine protection was the only shield she could wield. And so, as the day of delivery approached, Magdalene's determination became both her strength and her vulnerability. She was carrying not only a child, but the embodiment of a challenge to centuries of secrecy, a living testament to the conflict between faith, corruption, and human conscience. Every movement, every glance, every whispered word became part of the unfolding drama, a delicate dance on the knife's edge between revelation and disaster. She understood that the birth would be a turning point, a moment that would ripple through the convent, the church, and the lives of everyone involved, setting in motion events that could not be undone. The church had always been careful about appearances. The outer world saw only the serene gardens, the hymns echoing through stone corridors, and the glowing candles in the chapel. No one could suspect the labyrinth of secrets beneath those sacred walls, the twisted system that turned devotion into deception, piety into profiteering, and innocence into a commodity. When the scandal surrounding the infants began to ripple through the convent, the priests knew that intervention was necessary, and they arrived under the cover of darkness, their footsteps echoing in corridors that had grown accustomed to silence. The arrival of the priests was deliberate and calculated. They came not to comfort or advise, but to inspect, interrogate, and enforce obedience. Their faces, often serene during daytime sermons, became masks of authority and intimidation when navigating the hidden realities of the infirmary and the nursery. The nuns, many of whom had long lived in fear and secrecy, were commanded to remain silent, to never discuss what had occurred or what they had witnessed. Questions were answered with warnings, whispers punished with cold glares, and any hint of disobedience met with reminders of divine judgment and temporal authority. The church understood that scandal, once spoken aloud, could spread like wildfire. It was far easier to suffocate the truth than to allow it to breathe. Interrogations were carried out in private chambers, where the priests would summon nuns one by one. Their questions were subtle, seemingly concerned, yet laden with threat. They asked about the infants, about unusual occurrences, about whispers in the halls, and about any signs that a child might have been born outside the convent's prescribed protocols. Every answer had to be precise, measured, and obedient. Hesitation was a danger, and any deviation from the expected narrative was interpreted as evidence of complicity or guilt. The priest's authority was absolute, their presence a reminder that the church could reach into every corner, see every secret, and punish every transgression. The nuns quickly learned that silence was their only safeguard. Any discussion of the scandal, any hint that a child's origin might be questioned, was met with immediate rebuke. The threat of punishment extended beyond the individual. A misstep could compromise the entire convent, leading to public disgrace, removal of leadership, or intervention by higher church authorities. Obedience was enforced with a mixture of fear, shame, and religious indoctrination, ensuring that those who bore witness to the horrors of the nursery remained voiceless. In the shadows of the convent, the priests themselves were not immune to moral ambiguity. Some appeared to wrestle privately with guilt, though it was never spoken aloud. Others moved with clinical detachment, treating the infants, the nuns, and the enslaved mothers as instruments of an institution larger than any individual conscience. Their interventions were precise, designed to maintain the illusion of holiness while reinforcing the control the church exerted over every aspect of convent life. They inspected ledgers, checked infant records, and verified the transactions, all while reminding the nuns that failure to comply would have spiritual and temporal consequences. Fear permeated every interaction. The nuns lived with the knowledge that any slip of the tongue, any unintended revelation could undo decades of secrecy. Even casual conversation in the refectory was monitored. Eyes followed movements, ears strained to catch whispers. The walls, already heavy with the silent cries of infants and the subdued sobs of mothers, seemed to press down, amplifying anxiety and reinforcing control. No one could escape the sense of constant surveillance, a pervasive dread that kept obedience intact and ensured that the scandal remained hidden. Despite these measures, tension within the convent was palpable. Sister Magdalene, whose pregnancy had sparked suspicion and concern, became the focal point of both fear and fascination. Her insistence that the child was a divine blessing clashed with the priest's need for control and secrecy. They demanded her silence, reminding her of her vows, her duties, and the consequences of defiance. The nuns around her were divided. Some believed her claim, drawn to the idea of a miracle and hoping that divine favor might absolve their complicity. Others saw the pregnancy as sin incarnate, a threat to the convent's stability and a challenge to the church's authority. The divisions were subtle but profound, shaping alliances and deepening the undercurrents of fear and suspicion. The infants themselves became instruments in the struggle for control. The priests ensured that each child's movements were monitored, that records were meticulously maintained, and that transfers to families outside the convent were conducted with ritualized precision. They spoke in hushed tones to the nuns, reinforcing obedience while offering no comfort. Every action was designed to maintain the appearance of holiness, to preserve the church's image, and to suppress the truth. Any deviation, no matter how minor, was met with immediate correction. Over time, the pressure mounted. The nuns grew exhausted, their loyalty strained by the relentless weight of secrecy and obedience. Some began to crumble inwardly, their faith conflicted by conscience and fear. Sister Agnes, who had long kept secret notes detailing the births and the infants' fates, felt the walls closing in. Every day brought the possibility of discovery, yet she could not abandon her silent record-keeping. She understood that the church's intervention, while outwardly protective, also reinforced the moral imprisonment of everyone involved. The priest's presence, while outwardly calm, left scars. Their inspections, interrogations, and subtle threats maintained a rigid order, ensuring that the scandal would not escape the convent. But in enforcing silence, they also amplified the psychological toll on the nuns, mothers, and infants alike. The church had succeeded in containing the scandal temporarily, but the weight of hidden truth, the unacknowledged suffering, and the moral compromises required to maintain secrecy created a pressure that could not remain hidden forever. Even in the quietest moments, the memory of the priest's arrival lingered. Their footsteps echoed in empty corridors, their voices haunted the infirmary, and their authority shaped the behavior of every nun. The infants, too, carried the imprint of their intervention, transferred, blessed, and removed under careful supervision, their lives bound to secrecy and fear. Within the convent, the shadow of the Church's control was absolute, but it could not erase the moral fractures, the whispered doubts, and the seeds of rebellion quietly growing among those who had witnessed the truth. And so the scandal remained alive, not in public, but within the hidden hearts of the convent. The Church had demanded silence, and for a time it had succeeded. Yet even in enforced quiet, the echoes of suffering, the injustice of stolen children, and the moral conflict of those bound to obedience persisted, ensuring that one day the truth would find its way to the light. The young boy vanished overnight, leaving the convent steeped in whispers and uncertainty. No one could confirm what had happened, and the sudden disappearance set the entire hierarchy on edge. Some said he had fled into the dense woods that hugged the outskirts of the convent, seeking freedom from the shadows that had defined his earliest days. Others believed, with more chilling certainty, that he had been taken by priests or senior nuns who feared exposure, who understood that his presence was a living threat to the carefully constructed narrative of holiness and divine blessing. His absence became a puzzle, a crack in the walls of secrecy that the Church and convent had built over decades, and every whispered theory carried its own weight of fear and suspicion. The boy had been more than a child, he had been a symbol. Born of the union between a nun and one of the enslaved or coerced workers, he embodied the impossible truth that the convent had long denied. His eyes, bright and knowing beyond his years, had observed too much. He had been present for the hushed cries in the nursery, had witnessed the rituals that disguised transactions as miracles, and had felt the cold calculation of those who moved him from one cradle to another, to the priests, to the senior sisters, and to the Church itself. He was a dangerous reminder that innocence could reveal corruption. To flee or be taken was, in their eyes, a necessity for the survival of the institution. In the dead of night, those who had been assigned to his care found his bed empty. The blankets were undisturbed in some ways but shifted in others, as though he had left in a hurry, guided by instinct or desperation. Sister Magdalene, who had grown fond of the boy despite her own precarious position, was stricken with a mixture of relief and terror. Relief, because he might have escaped the machinery of exploitation. Terror, because if the Church discovered his absence, the consequences could be catastrophic for her and for anyone who had shown compassion. Her hands shook as she lit a lantern, illuminating the empty cradle, the air heavy with the scent of the evening, and the faint echo of a child's laughter that now belonged to memory. The nuns gathered in secret to discuss what had happened, though each word was chosen with care. Fear governed their conversations as surely as any written law. Perhaps he went into the forest, one whispered, eyes darting toward the shadows. He may survive there. Another shook her head, voice low. He could have been taken by the priests. They fear what he knows. Even among themselves there was no consensus, no comfort. The convent, usually rigid in routine, now trembled with uncertainty. The boy's disappearance was not merely a logistical problem, it was a moral and spiritual challenge. His absence threatened the authority of the Church, the credibility of the nuns, and the carefully maintained illusion of sanctity that had guided the convent for decades. Outside the convent walls, rumors began to circulate. Some townspeople claimed to have seen a small figure moving through the woods near the river, moving with surprising speed and agility for a child of his age. Others claimed that shadows moved in strange ways around the convent itself, as though the boy's presence, or absence, had awakened a lingering spirit of unrest. These whispers reached the ears of a few influential parishioners, but fear of the Church's authority prevented any investigation. The boy, like the infants before him, existed in a liminal space between revelation and concealment, a living testament to the injustices hidden behind the convent's holy facade. Those who had been closest to him felt the absence keenly. Sister Agnes, who had carefully documented the births and fates of the infants, saw in his disappearance both hope and dread. Hope that he might escape the oppressive system that had shaped his earliest days, and dread that the consequences for his absence could be severe, both for him and for those who had nurtured him. She recalled the boy's curiosity, his questions about the world beyond the convent, and his insistence on seeking the truth despite the subtle warnings that silence was safest. His disappearance was, in some ways, a culmination of what the nuns had always feared, that innocence and knowledge combined could undermine the church's carefully maintained order. The priests, once aware of the absence, moved with swift, silent efficiency. They searched rooms, questioned nuns, and inspected ledgers, their calm exterior hiding an urgency that betrayed their true concern. Each corner of the convent was examined, every staircase, every hidden panel, every cellar beneath the chapel. Yet no trace was found. Their failure only intensified their unease. The boy was no longer a simple infant or ward of the convent. He had become a symbol, a living accusation against centuries of secrecy and moral compromise. As days passed without news, tension within the convent grew. The nuns moved cautiously, aware that any misstep in speech or gesture could invite suspicion. Eyes darted in corridors, whispers were hushed, and rituals became more precise, almost desperate in their execution. The absence of the boy reminded every sister of the fragility of the system they had been forced to serve and of the constant threat posed by those who might refuse to comply with its rules. Every child born in secrecy, every transaction disguised as holy providence, was a potential breach of the carefully constructed veil. The boy had become that breach, exposing the vulnerabilities inherent in a system built on fear and obedience rather than truth and compassion. Some speculated that the boy had fled to protect himself, drawn by instinct and the faint memory of freedom glimpsed in the rare moments outside the nursery. Others believed he had been quietly removed by priests who feared what he might reveal in years to come. Regardless of the reality, the disappearance became legend within the convent, a cautionary tale whispered to novices and younger sisters alike. It reinforced the necessity of silence, obedience, and concealment, but it also ignited a flicker of moral doubt that some could not suppress. In the shadows of the infirmary and the hidden nurseries, the absence of the boy remained palpable. Sisters who had been closest to him carried his memory like a weight, a reminder of the cruelty imposed on the innocent and the moral compromises they were forced to endure. Even the walls seemed to retain the echo of his small footsteps, the sound of his laughter, the tremble of his voice when he asked forbidden questions. He had become more than a child. He was a living testament to truth, morality, and the possibility of escape from a system designed to suppress both. The boy's disappearance did not erase the scandal, nor did it bring closure. It became part of the hidden history of the convent, a silent rebellion against the church's authority and a lingering question of what might happen when innocence refuses to be contained. The nuns continued their work, the priests continued their oversight, and the infants continued to be sold and blessed under the guise of holiness, but the memory of the boy remained, a haunting, invisible presence that reminded all who knew of him that truth, though suppressed, always finds a way to assert itself. The convent had become a landscape of fear, devotion, and whispers, divided in ways that could not be seen on the polished floors or beneath the ornate arches of the chapel. Half the sisters viewed the child as a divine sign, a miracle that had been delivered into their care despite the constraints of vows and tradition. They saw in his birth a chance to believe that God, in ways unknowable and mysterious, could intervene in even the most controlled and oppressive environments. Every glance at the infant, every see-oo or cry, reinforced the notion that the sacred could coexist with the profane, that purity and corruption were not always mutually exclusive. These sisters treated the child with reverence, speaking in hushed tones as if to protect him from both mortal eyes and spiritual judgment. They whispered prayers over him, wrapped him in cloth with extra care, and allowed themselves, in fleeting moments, to hope that this birth could redeem more than just the child. It could redeem their faith itself. The other half, however, regarded the child with horror and suspicion. To them, he was a living embodiment of sin, the tangible proof that vows had been violated and secrecy compromised. They feared contamination of the soul, the desecration of the convent, and the moral collapse that they believed the child represented. Every movement he made, every cry he uttered, became evidence to them of transgression, a threat to the order that had been imposed to preserve holiness and obedience. They demanded that he be removed, hidden, or even erased. invoking scripture, canon law, and fear to justify their calls for expulsion. Their devotion to rules was as fierce as the other sisters' devotion to faith, but it was a devotion rooted in control, conformity, and terror rather than wonder and compassion. This division seeped into the daily rhythms of the convent. Meals, prayers, and chores were punctuated by subtle tensions, eyes narrowed in suspicion, hands brushed against the infant only under careful scrutiny. Whispered conversations carried the weight of judgment and allegiance. Those who supported the idea of divinity in the child found themselves cautious, hiding their gestures of care from those who saw them as morally suspect. Those who feared the child's presence interpreted the smallest act of tenderness as rebellion. The very air of the convent seemed charged, a static current that electrified every interaction, reminding each sister that her position, her faith, and her conscience were constantly under assessment. The priests, who remained the ultimate arbiters of truth, were aware of the growing division and moved to maintain control. They encouraged silence and compliance, using their authority to prevent factions from forming too openly. They reminded the nuns that any hint of disagreement could be interpreted as disobedience, and disobedience would not be tolerated. These subtle interventions created a climate of tension where neither faction could fully assert itself, yet neither could completely suppress its convictions. The child, innocent and unaware of the ideological battles swirling around him, became the axis upon which the convent's moral and spiritual struggles turned. The tension reached its peak when small incidents began to occur, whispered arguments in hallways, the misplacement of linens, infants left unattended for brief moments. Each act, however minor, was scrutinized as a possible breach of loyalty or faith. Sisters were forced to navigate the complex terrain of conscience, devotion, and survival. The child's cries were interpreted differently depending on who heard them. For some, a sign of divine presence; for others, a reminder of danger and sin. The same gesture could be read as holy care or dangerous indulgence, highlighting the stark division that had taken root. Within this climate, the child became almost mythical, a symbol whose meaning shifted with perspective. To those who believed in his sanctity, he represented hope, evidence that God could intervene in a place otherwise governed by secrecy and fear. To those who feared him, he represented moral collapse, the embodiment of what could go wrong when the rules were broken, when obedience failed, and when faith faltered in the face of human imperfection. Each sister's daily choices, how to feed him, how to comfort him, how to speak in his presence, were weighed against this duality, creating a constant tension that wore on nerves, bodies, and spirits alike. The division was not static. Over time, some of the sisters' convictions shifted as events unfolded. Observing the child's resilience, vitality, and the small signs of personality that emerged, even in the controlled environment of the convent, a few who had feared him began to soften. Their fear was replaced, slowly, by curiosity, then by cautious respect, though old anxieties lingered like shadows in corners. Conversely, some who had once believed in the child's divinity grew doubtful, influenced by the constant pressure of the other faction and by the subtle manipulations of the priests, who reminded them that divine gifts were rare, delicate, and subject to human judgment. The debates, though mostly silent, shaped the care the child received. Food, clothing, and attention were allocated in ways that reflected both devotion and fear. Sisters who believed in his divinity found creative ways to provide comfort while avoiding the scrutiny of those who distrusted him. Those who feared the child monitored him closely, correcting what they saw as indulgence or improper handling. Every day became a negotiation, a delicate dance between conscience, survival, and the competing interpretations of holiness and sin. The child's presence, innocent and unwitting, forced the sisters to confront their own beliefs, fears, and loyalties. It was as though he existed not only as an individual being, but as a mirror reflecting the deepest fractures in the convent's spiritual life. Through him, the nuns were forced to ask questions they could not answer. What is divine? What is sinful? How far can obedience go before it becomes complicity? And how does one balance faith with conscience when both seem to demand opposing truths? Ultimately, the division within the convent would define the atmosphere for years to come. The child's existence was a living challenge, a moral fulcrum around which fear and faith pivoted. Every interaction, every whispered debate, every quiet act of care or suspicion carried significance. The convent, outwardly a place of order, became internally a battlefield of conscience, morality, and belief, with the child at the center, both vulnerable and powerful in his innocence. Even decades later, the legend of the child's role in the convent endured. Sisters who survived spoke in hushed tones about the divisions, the silent battles, and the way one small life could shape the moral and spiritual landscape of an entire institution. The child had been more than a miracle or a scandal. He had been a test, a catalyst, and a reflection of the human heart's capacity for faith, fear, and moral complexity in the shadow of a church that demanded obedience above all else. For those who study history, ethics, or faith, this story offers more than shock. It provides insight into the complex interplay of power and morality. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How far will institutions go to protect their image? How easily can innocence be exploited? And how does one reconcile devotion to faith with the responsibility to protect life? These questions remain relevant today, reminding viewers that the darkest corners of history are often mirrors reflecting our own society, our own institutions, and our own choices. The tale of the Blessed Child also invites reflection on resilience, the courage of those who dared to act with conscience in the midst of oppression, the subtle acts of defiance that challenged authority, and the enduring hope that life, even in its most vulnerable form, can assert itself. It is a reminder that while power may attempt to suppress truth, memory and moral courage can never be entirely extinguished. For audiences seeking history's hidden narratives, moral complexity, and tales that provoke thought while chilling the spine, this story stands unparalleled. It blends the terror of secrecy with the awe of human resilience, offering both a cautionary tale and a narrative of hope, however darkly framed. The Blessed Child's legacy endures not only in legend, but in the hearts of those who dare to confront the shadows of history and recognize that truth, however concealed, will always find a way to echo through time. In the end, the Blessed Child is more than a figure of scandal or miracle. He is a witness to the extremes of human nature, a symbol of innocence confronted by corruption, and a reminder that history's hidden stories carry lessons that are as relevant today as they were centuries ago. To explore them is to step into a world where faith, fear, and conscience collide, leaving behind echoes that haunt, educate, and endure.